Hi, and welcome to Watercolor Techniques with Michelle Stovall. Today I want to show you the basic techniques needed for watercolor painting. Our first technique is masking. So masking should be done first to protect any area of your paper you wish to keep free of paint. Here I've used washi tape to mask a shape I wish not to be painted. When using tape as a masking, always make sure to choose a tape that does not leave residue on your paper. Washi tape's always a good choice, as well as painter's tape. You can also use masking fluid to cover any irregular shapes that you'd like to keep white on your painting. So here we've waited until our painting is completely dry or bone dry before removing our masking tape or masking fluid. This ensures that the lines will be as clean as possible and won't remove any paint during the process. And that's masking. So blotting is a technique used basically as an eraser for your paint. Any mistakes you make, you can use this technique to lift the paint from the paper. Always make sure that you have a clean paper towel, tissue, or cloth with you, either in your hand or next to you, while painting with watercolor. This ensures that you are always ready and able to pick up any wet paint that has been mistakenly placed on your paper or you don't want to be there. It's basically an eraser for watercolor. So make sure to always blot quickly. Time is of the essence. It is also good to know that some watercolors do leave a stain. Some reds as well as some of your blues will be a permanent stain on the paper, and so no matter how much you try, the blotting can't remove all the color. So here we have the technique of lifting. Lifting is basically blotting, but you're using your brush instead as a way to erase or remove pigment. So basically, once you've laid down your paint and you want to take away any pigment that you might have put down by mistake or just want a lighter area, you clean your brush out and then take off some excess water from the brush. Then you take that brush that you've just cleaned and put it on your paper, and it will lift away the pigment that you don't want there. So here I'm laying out a green paint just to show you how much pigments can stain or be able to be taken off depending on what color they are. So with this green paint, you can see I'm taking away as much pigment as possible, and I'm able to actually get to the white of the paper. So here we have a controlled wash. So your controlled wash is just trying to have one color evenly distributed on your painting. So make sure you always have a clean paper towel or tissue on hand with you at all times. This way you can use it to help quickly absorb any water or paint you don't want in the area left over. So here I'm mixing my paint and water evenly to make sure it's always one hue. So take your paint, put it on your paper, and you want to quickly stroke top to bottom, side to side. You're moving the bead of paint all over the area you wish to paint fast and smooth. Once you've covered the area, you're going to take the paint out of your brush and then use your brush to lift any excess unwanted paint or water off your area that you're painting. So you want to do this quickly to make sure it doesn't dry too fast. Make sure again you're using that paper towel to pick up any unwanted paint left over. So if your wash that you've just laid down is too light, you can always go over it with another wash, but you want to make sure that you've let your painting completely dry before going over it with more paint. This way you can avoid having too much water left on your paper, which can lead to water spots and an uneven wash, which is what you're trying to avoid. So here we have the grated wash. So your grated wash is just basically creating an ombre on your paper. So you're going to take and load your brush with paint, and then taking that paint, you're going to go from top to bottom, side to side. But instead of going and adding more paint to your brush, you're going to slowly add more water. So here I'm adding water to my brush, moving that bead of paint down my paper, and then cleaning your brush with more water, and again still quickly going and moving your bead. So as you go down, your brush will have more water and less paint until finally there is no more paint left in your brush and there's only clean, clear water at the end. If you need to, for any reason, take off or smooth out your ombre, you can always again clean your brush, and then this way you're going to want to, instead of going from top to bottom, you're going to want to go bottom to top and clean up any paint or water that may be left over. So here we have the technique of transparency. So transparency is just a controlled wash of paint that you've let completely dry on your paper, and then taking another color, you're going to do another controlled wash on top of that color. With these two overlapping colors, once dried, you're going to be able to see a new color created. You can see, if you try it yourself, if you took this green and red and mixed them together straight on your paper, it would create a dull gray color, but with the transparency, having the green completely dry first and then the red over, you can still see the vibrant green coming through. So here we have the technique of dry brush. Right now we're going to use a round brush that is completely dry. You're going to load your brush with paint, and then you can play and see what happens on your paper while using this brush. The texture of the paper will determine a lot of the texture that your brush will create with the paint. Also, the shape of your brush will be shown. So just play around with the direction, how you're going to stroke the brush. The more paint you add to the brush, the wetter it's going to get, which will then lose a lot of the texture. So here's the dry brush technique again, this time using a flat brush. You can see that the brush is completely dry. You then pick up your paint, and then you can just experiment and see again how that brush reacts with the texture of the paper and your bristles as well. Here you can see that the bristles have separated, and you can now see them clearly defined on your paper. So here we have the technique of wet into wet. So for wet into wet, you're going to actually just take your clean water, brush it on the area you wish to paint. Once that area is thoroughly wet, then you're going to take whatever color you choose and then add it to that area of wetted paper. So here I'm choosing a cadmium red. We're going to load our brush, and then you're basically just going to add your pigment directly into the wet paper. With the wet paper, it's going to disperse the color, and it won't do it evenly due to the fact that this is a cold press paper, and a lot of the texture in this paper will now create where the pigment's going to go, and then you can move your pigment anywhere you choose, add any other color you'd like, and then once those are added, here I'm going to add some yellow to it. So instead of just mixing your pigments on your palette, you can now actually mix them and create different colors on the paper. I just like to let the paper kind of decide how it's going to mix. It's more organic with wet into wet, and it's a lot less about control and just letting what the paper and pigment want to do together. So here's the final result, completely dried, of a wet into wet look. So here we have charging watercolors. So charging watercolors is going to be a bit of a wet into wet mixed with the grated wash technique. So charging watercolors, you're actually going to be having the brush mix the colors as well as the paper. You won't actually mix your two colors on your palette. So first I'm going to take my yellow, and just like doing a grated wash, you're going to start at the top. I'm taking the pigment and paint, and I'm going to start moving it down my paper. And then instead of adding more yellow, I'm going to actually take then the red, which will then mix the two colors in my brush and use the brush and water in the brush to mix and create a new color as I'm painting. So you can see I'm taking the red, it's mixed, it's creating a new orange. I'm going to take some more red, and you can see as I move down the paper and choose and take more red pigment from my palette and into my brush, I will now be left only with red in my brush and on the paper. So this kind of creates a gradient effect, and you can see now the paper is now mixing the colors together using this charging technique. Here we have the technique of using watercolor pencils. So watercolor pencils, they'll react with water and basically change into a watercolor paint. With watercolor pencil, it is nice to be able to use them on their own on top of a watercolor painting, or you can actually wet them with clean water and have them act just like a regular watercolor would. So the nice thing about using watercolor pencils is their precision and also the level of saturation you'll get with their pigment. They'll leave a nice strong line that a brush can't, but also if you want that line to disappear, it's easy enough to add a little water and soften it up so that it blends seamlessly with your brush strokes. Here I'm just showing you an example of what I've directly wet the pencil, and then I'm going to show you the pencil dries. So here we have the technique of using salt added to your paint. So after you've painted your area, you can take salt. Here I'm using regular table salt, but you can also use kosher salt, coarse salt. These different shapes will create a different shape on your paint. Just experiment to see what kind of shapes you like. Make sure to always have your paint dry completely before dusting your salt off. So here's an example after the paint has completely dried and the salt has been brushed off. You can see the unique shapes that the salt has created in your paint. So here we have the technique of using alcohol to also create unique and organic shapes in your paint. Here I'm just dropping rubbing alcohol on top of my paint as it's still wet. You can experiment with the amount of droplets you'd like to use. If you want to put the alcohol in your brush and paint some alcohol on, it just depends how you want your shapes to be. Again, it's very organic. You can experiment with how little or how much you'd want to move your paint around with this technique. So here you see the final technique as the paint has dried with the alcohol. So here we have the technique of using a sponge to create a texture or shapes on your painting. So basically it's pretty self-explanatory. You just take your sponge. I've wetted it a bit, and I'm using now taking my paint and putting it on the paper, using the sponge's shape and the holes in it to create different textures or shapes on my paper. You can also paint on your paper, so I'm just doing a wash quickly here, and then you can take your sponge and actually use it as a blotting technique. That will then take off any pigment in the shape of the natural holes, and this will then have some nice organic shapes and textures left on my paper. So you can use different types of sponges. Here I'm using just a synthetic sponge, but you can also use natural sponges. How wet the sponge is versus how dry will create different textures, as well as the density and different sizes of holes in the sponge. So here we have the technique of splatter. So basically you're just going to load your brush with paint, then you're going to firmly tap your brush. This will then spray or splatter your paint onto the paper. Make sure you've masked off any area of your painting that you don't want the paint to have landed on. Make sure also the area you're painting on is easily cleaned, or that you don't mind having paint land on it. You can also take other colors and then use that technique as you splatter them, and they all mix as they dry on your paper. So here we have the technique of scratching. So to scratch, basically you just take any sharp object. Here I'm using an X-Acto knife, and you're scraping away the surface of the paper, taking away any paint and revealing the white paper underneath. The key is to make sure that your paper is completely dry, that your paint is not wet. If it's wet, you won't have a clean line and you'll accidentally remove too much paint. So with gentle light strokes, you just want to gently scratch the surface of your paper, revealing the amount of white that you need. Any spots that you want to have highlights of white shown, scratching is great